Hello everyone, bachphotography here, back with another video, so thank you for joining me once again. Today we're looking at mistakes that beginner photographers make and how you can avoid these mistakes in your photography to take your photos to the next level. So I'm going to start off with the first tip that I think is the most important tip and something that even professional photographers overlook, and that is not spending enough time looking around your location and finding the best spots where you can take the best photos, because your background is going to take up 50 to 75%, even more, of your final image, even if you're doing portraits. So it's really important to have a really nice looking background, but also to make sure that you have the best lighting in your scene as well. So what I like to do before the model gets to the location is I just like to walk around the area, especially if it's somewhere like a park or somewhere that you haven't been before, and take note of all the different places that you think might make a good photo shoot location. So what I normally do is I take out my phone and I start taking photos of areas that I think might be good potential candidates, and I also take a screenshot of my map as well so that I can find where each of these locations are in my photo gallery on my phone. And then while I'm doing the photo shoot, I just cycle through every single location that I liked, and I can normally find 5 or 6 really solid locations on a photo shoot. So here's an example of a photo on the left that doesn't have a particularly interesting background and also has quite poor lighting. And then the photo on the right, which has much more interesting lighting and a nice textured background. You can see just how big of a difference that actually makes. We can see on the left that the lighting on our subject here is blotchy and not very flattering, whereas on the right we have one side of our model's face dark and one side light, which makes a nice depth to her face and accentuates her facial features. On the left, the background is very busy but also not very interesting, and it doesn't bring anything to the photo. But the background of the right photo has a very nice textured wall, which adds a little bit of interest to the background, but it's also angled in a position to add depth to the image, and also it's nice and blurry so that we can see the difference between the sharpness of our subject and the blurriness and different texture of the background. You can also see that there's been thought put into the right photo with the bushes on the left side of the image, and that adds a little bit more depth by adding some foreground features into the photo. Whereas when you look at the first photo on the left, there isn't really anything in the foreground of the image, and it makes the image look much more two-dimensional and flat. So now you know that you have to choose your location wisely to get the best photos, but how exactly do you do that? Well, there's a few things to keep in mind when choosing your location. The most important thing is having a nice, soft, even light so that your model can have really flattering light on her, and then there's no distractions from any really bright highlights or really dark shadows in the image. You also want to make sure that the background doesn't have lots of clutter in it or anything that might distract your viewer from looking at the subject of your image. You might also consider only having a couple of different colors in the background, so not having too many bright and bold colors, which could also be a distraction to your viewer. So now that we have the perfect location, the next mistake that a lot of people make is not taking enough time to get the lighting and composition of their photo perfect. In the digital age of mirrorless cameras that can take 10 or 15 or even 20 frames per second, we really don't spend as much time as we used to in the film days getting the composition and the lighting conditions and everything perfect in frame before we take the photo. And I think this art is really lost in the digital age, and just taking a little bit more time to get everything right in camera is going to not only get better photos, but it's also going to save you a lot of time culling images that aren't perfect in camera. So here we can see 2 photos, both of which are relatively badly composed, but I've changed just one thing that makes one of these photos look much better than the other. And that is that our subject, Shanae here, is fully in the frame and is also positioned at a 90-degree angle straight on to the camera. If you look at the left photo, you can see that she is slightly almost cropped out with her foot on one side, and there is a different size gap between the left and right side of her in the photo. Whereas on the right photo, she is composed better because she has an even gap between the left of her body and the right of her body. And even though this photo isn't composed perfectly, and a lot of the lines in this photo aren't straight, just little subtle changes like this to your photo is going to make a huge difference to the final product. So in a lot of ways, this error that people make when taking portraits in particular is another example of why taking your time and thinking about your shots and not rushing your photos is going to be a really good way to get much better photos, but also a much better ratio of good to bad photos. So to battle this problem, just make sure that when you're taking your photos, is it composed correctly? Is the camera straight onto your subject? Is your subject in the right area of the photo? Are all the angles lined up correctly? If you think of these things before you hit that shutter button, you're going to get much better photos every time. Before we move on to the next tip to avoid, please make sure, if you're enjoying this content, to leave a like and subscribe. It really helps me out a lot in the YouTube algorithm, so thank you very much for subscribing. Another mistake that a lot of photographers make is one that is really difficult to master and perfect, and that is getting perfect focus on every photo. Now, I think it is going to be difficult to get perfect focus on every single photo, but it's going to help a lot if you slow down with your photography, make sure that you have a great focus, everything is nice and sharp before you take the photo. And the wider you shoot, so at lower apertures, this is going to be much more difficult. So it's important that you take multiple photos of the thing that you would like to take a photo of, so that you have a much higher chance of getting that sharp photo. And don't worry too much if you're missing focus every so often, or if some of your photos are a bit blurry, but try your best to get nice sharp eyes in your portraits and spend a little bit more time making sure that the focus of your photo is perfect. Because having a photo that is just slightly out of focus is going to be much less appealing to the viewer than having a photo that is perfectly sharp. So here are two photos taken one after another. You can see they're very, very similar, but one of them, the photo on the right, doesn't have very good focus, whereas the photo on the left has perfectly sharp focus. Now, when you're looking at the photos from this distance, you can't really tell the difference between the photos, even when you misfocus a little bit. But as soon as you zoom in onto your focal point, you can really tell that there's a massive difference between shooting a perfectly sharp photo and a photo that's just slightly blurry. If your photo is slightly blurry, it's going to make your viewer distracted by other parts of your image which are more sharp. And in this case, the wall behind our model is more sharp, which leads our viewer to look at the wall as well as Sinead. And that is just going to make the photo less visually appealing. So before we move on to the next mistake that a lot of photographers make, I'm really happy to announce that I've just released a new photography course for anyone who's looking to go from absolute beginner in photography to an advanced photographer who knows everything they need to know to take amazing portraits. The course comes with hours of lectures and is set up in the way similar to a university lecture series. So there is going to be lectures on every aspect of photography that you need to know, as well as quizzes as you go to test your knowledge. And I'm also going to add a model release form, which is super important that you get your models to sign just to legally cover yourself whenever you do a photo shoot. So I'm going to be leaving a link to that in the description, along with a early bird 10% off coupon for anyone who wants to purchase this course in the next 30 days. I've spent a lot of time really making this course perfect for anyone who's looking to learn all about photography, so I really hope that you like it, and thank you very much for checking that out. So now let's have a look at some of the mistakes that people make in editing software that can make a massive difference to the final product of any image. The first thing that a lot of people don't do is they change the color balance of their image in post-production. You can see in this photo that there is a really blue color tinge to the entire photo, and you can see in Sinead's skin tone that there is a lot of blue happening here that might not be the ideal color balance for this image. So a lot of people would leave this and just trust their camera to say, okay, well, this is the right color balance. But because there was so much golden light in this photo, the camera actually compensated and made the entire image more blue. So what we're going to do here is slide the color slider over until we can get a nice color balance, something that looks a little bit more warm and a bit more true to what the scene looked like when I took this photo. Another thing that people do is overdoing the addition of contrast and saturation to an image. So they'll get an image into Photoshop and they'll go to the brightness and contrast slider and they'll boost the contrast up way too far. And what happens when you do that is you lose a lot of the detail that you would see in some parts of the image. For example, we've lost a detail in the hair in this area here, we've lost some detail in the eyes, and overall the skin looks a bit strange and everything just looks a little too contrasty when you add contrast like that to a scene. So instead of doing it that way, what I like to do is use the camera raw filter and actually change the shadows, highlights, blacks and whites separately. And what that does is basically the difference between using the contrast slider and these four sliders here is that the contrast slider is going to boost the highlights, the shadows, the whites and the blacks all in one go. Whereas if I use one of these tools separately, the highlights are going to be the mid-tone bright areas of the scene, and then the shadows are going to be the mid-tone dark parts of the scene. And I have a lot more flexibility with how I change all of these settings in this image. And then we also have the whites, which are the really white parts of the scene, and the blacks, which are the really black parts of the scene. So you can see I have a lot more control on getting the perfect exposure in every part of the image when I use these 4 sliders instead of the contrast tool. And the same thing goes for using the saturation slider compared to the vibrant slider. When I change the saturation, all of the colors in the scene get more colorful in a linear way. So even the really pale colors get the same amount more colorful than the really colorful areas. And what that means is that maybe if I want to make the greens a little bit more green, well, I have to also make the oranges of the skin much more orange and the blues much more blue, and everything just looks really crazy when you add saturation in this way. So one way that you can get around that is using the vibrant slider, which means that only the subtle parts of the image, the subtle colors, are going to become more bright, and that means that your skin tones are going to look better. But one thing that you can do that's even better than that is going into this adjustments area here and changing just the colors you want to change manually. And that means that you can avoid changing the orange tones, which typically means that you're going to avoid making the skin tones look strange. So that is how you have more flexibility when you're adding more color into your scene. So that's everything for this video. I really hope you enjoyed it. I'm going to leave a link to some of the raw files from this photo shoot in the description of this video if you'd like to check those out. And I'm also going to leave a link to my photography course if you would like to enroll in that as well. And I really hope that you enjoy that course. So thank you very much once again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.